Good afternoon, friends. Please take your seat. We're going to get to work. This afternoon, we will try to establish some realities. You know, there's a lot of disinformation or lack of information, I don't know how much of it is intentional, about what has gone on in Ukraine. So that is one of the things that, of course, we want to accomplish, is get a little more clarity about some ambiguous facts. And a larger purpose, or the purpose of the whole day, is, of course, to try to find common ground, see if there are any, especially if there are any policies that are acceptable to most of the belligerent parties, so that we can bring fertile suggestions to the negotiators and to the decision makers and help put a stop to this war. So we have two panelists here and one panelist up there. Hi, Fred Weir. I won't spend a lot of time, since you have, or you should have, a program with more ample biography of these people. But Paul Robinson, immediately to my left, is he knows his way around this campus because he has a degree from U of T, the Slavic Studies program. And he has served as a reserve officer in the Canadian Forces and did research worked in media research in Moscow. He's published a number of books, and I'm not going to try to summarize your books, but he will be the first speaker. Then we will have Fred Weir from Moscow. Hi, Fred. Fred is a Canadian who has lived in Moscow how many years? 30, 40 years?
No, about 29. All 29 right. In October.
Anyway, you're holding something like a record. He's a journalist who is the correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. And then to my far left is Borys Wrzesnewskyj, who is a former member of Parliament for the Liberal Party and a businessman. And he owns a future bakery. And he has a long history of being supportive to Ukrainian, is it fair to say Ukrainian nationalist groups?
Well, I'd say Ukrainian democracy. Good. And Ukrainian independence.
Very good, yeah. He supported Rook during those days, those early days. And he will be our last speaker. We will have 20 minutes or so for each person to give a talk. Then we will have, each of you will have an index card, and those of you who have a question, you should write your questions down on the card. Someone, I hope, will come and collect them. If nobody does, Martin will collect them, and if necessary, and sort them out, and we'll have a little discussion among ourselves while the sorting is going on. Then we will have the questions posed to the panelists. Okay, very good. Now, I want to give the floor then to Paul Robinson.
Good afternoon. What I shall do in the next 20 minutes or so is look at each of the main actors involved in this tragedy: the Russian state, the Ukrainian government, the rebels, and the Western powers, and to answer the questions which are in the title of the panel, who has done what and why. Okay? And so I'll start, first of all, with Russia. So if we go back to April of last year, what I say as well is that I'm going to focus on the war in Donbass rather than Crimea. So if we go back to April of last year, we find very little, if any, evidence of direct Russian involvement in the start of the uprising in Donbass. At that point, protesters seized government buildings and weapons. Yet although many commentators described this as a repeat of what had happened in Crimea, it was very different. The seizure of Crimea was orderly and peaceful. The protests in Donbass weren't. They resembled mob rule more than anything else. nor were there any so-called little green men or polite people. They no plausible evidence has been produced to indicate that members of the Russian army were involved at the start of the uprising. That is not to say that there were no Russian citizens. There were, the most important being 52 men led by Igor Strelkov, who arrived in Slavyansk from Crimea in mid-April. This led to speculation that Strelkov was an agent of the Russian Secret Service, the FSB, and that the entire uprising was orchestrated by it. However, the more one studies Strelkov, the less plausible this scenario seems, and it comes across very much that he was a loose cannon, almost certainly acting on his own. He himself claims that the initiative and the actions came not from Moscow, but from Donbass protesters who visited him in Crimea. The Russian secret services may have known what was going on, he said, but they weren't directly involved. And that seems to fit the facts as I understand them. At this point in time, Russia was largely standing on the sidelines. That remained the case until July. As the rebels built an army in May and June, they supplied themselves almost entirely with weapons seized from the Ukrainian army and secret services. Huge quantities of Ukrainian army equipment fell into rebel hands. But there was very little direct Russian support at this stage. Strelkov, who by May was fighting a full-scale war in Slavyansk, issued regular communiques complaining that Russia had abandoned him. Interestingly, at this point until mid-August, the head of the political department of the army of the Donetsk People's Republic was a guy called Igor Ivanov. He wrote a letter in July to a newspaper in which he said, Putin не предатель, он просто враг. Putin's not a traitor, he's simply an enemy. And this was coming from the head of the rebels' political department. So you could see that at this stage, the guys running the rebellion were not really under Moscow's control. In fact, they didn't really like the government in Moscow very much. What we did see in these early days was the arrival of large numbers of Russian volunteers who joined the rebel ranks. However, these have always been a small minority of the rebel force. The vast majority of the rebels, probably about 90% of them, are Ukrainian citizens. This isn't a war in which Ukrainians are primarily fighting Russians, but a war in which Ukrainians are fighting Ukrainians. The Russian volunteers were in any case individuals rather than units of the Russian army. I have found no credible evidence of the Russian army being directly involved in combat operations in Ukraine until mid-July of last year, at which point it seems likely that Russian artillery fired across the border at Ukrainian units who were surrounded south of Lugansk. This, though, was still cross-border activity and didn't involve Russian troops actually fighting on Ukrainian soil. That changed in mid-August. Around that time, Russian supplies of weapons and ammunition, which had previously been quite small, seem to have increased substantially, and we have some fairly convincing evidence that units of the Russian army entered Ukraine in mid-August and helped inflict a major defeat on the Ukrainian army at the town of Ilovaisk before returning to Russia. How many troops were involved and how long they stayed, though, we cannot say, and it was probably not for very long. Since September, Russian supplies to the rebels have continued. The most important, as far as I can tell, is artillery ammunition. The rebels have been using far more of this than they could possibly have captured from Ukraine, at least until last week, when they seem to have captured an enormous amount of equipment at Debaltseve. So this equipment must have come from Russia, or at least the artillery ammunition. It would also appear that some Russian soldiers are in Donbass as military advisors and helping to train the rebel armies. There are also suggestions that Russians are providing intelligence and electronic warfare. However, even the chief of the Ukrainian General Staff, General Muzhenka, admits that Ukrainians are not fighting units of the Russian army. The frontline troops of the rebel armies, the infantry, the guys manning the artillery, the tanks and so on, are not Russian but local rebel militia consisting, as I said, overwhelmingly of Ukrainian citizens. If I can summarize all that, what it amounts to is that Russian military aid to the rebellion was initially very small but grew over time. The more resources that Ukraine puts into the war, the more Moscow puts in response. In that respect, Russia to a large degree has been reacting to events rather than leading them. That covers Russian military assistance. I'll now add a few words about Russia's political relationship with the rebel Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. This is shrouded in a lot of mystery. At first, there wasn't a lot of political leadership, just a few self-appointed guys who'd occupied some buildings. and who really didn't control anything at all. Any connection they had with Moscow was very tenuous. In mid-August, though, there was a significant change in leadership. Out went the leaders in Donetsk and Lugansk, Borodai and Bolotov, and out also went Igor Strelkov, who was by then commander of the Donetsk army. Now, we don't know for sure what went on, but it seems certain that they were pushed out by Moscow. And here we're definitely in the realm of speculation, but my sources in Russia tell me that this is most likely true. It seems as though what happened is that Strelkov and co. were given an ultimatum, which was that if you don't quit, your army won't get any support, but if you do quit, it will. And so they resigned. And in their place came the people who now lead the rebellion, Zakharchenko and Plotnitsky. And that brings us on to the why. Why engineer these changes in leadership? The answer, I believe, is that Moscow wasn't actually in control of events and wanted to establish some sort of control and to get leaders who were more amenable. In particular, the previous people in charge, particularly Strelkov, were pursuing an agenda entirely contrary to that of the Russian government. Russia has made it clear from the start that it is not interested in annexing Donbass. And it doesn't want a frozen conflict with rump little states in Donetsk and Lugansk, which would be economically unviable. Its preference has always been for Donbass to remain within Ukraine. At the same time, it recognizes that it cannot persuade the people of Donbass to accept this unless there are significant political changes in Ukraine, above all the granting of some sort of autonomy. So Russia's policy, I believe, has been to try to put just enough pressure on the Ukrainian government to make it negotiate. That means supporting the rebels enough so they don't lose, but not so much that they win. And that explains why Putin was willing to sign up to the first Minsk agreement in September, when the rebel leadership did not want to stop, and again in February. It also explains why Moscow changed the rebel leaders in August. Strelkov and those around him weren't interested in striking a deal. They had much more absolutist, nationalist agendas, and that agenda was not that of Moscow. Moscow wanted to negotiate with Kiev, and it needed leaders in Donetsk and Lugansk who might be willing to do that, and therefore it put in more moderate leadership. In that sense, strange as it may seem, Russia's role has been something of a moderating one. So what about the Ukrainian side? At an early stage in the Maidan protests, it would appear that the then opposition in Ukraine decided that its objective was not to reverse President Yanukovych's decision not to sign an agreement with the EU, but rather to overthrow him. On several occasions, the opposition leaders were offered compromises which would have put them in charge of the government, but left Yanukovych in place, but these offers were rejected. In 2004, during the Orange Revolution, Viktor Yushchenko had rejected overthrowing the government by force, as he understood that this could lead to civil war. On Maidan, however, this caution was thrown to the wind. There was an interesting article in Friday's Globe and Mail by Mark McKinnon, in which he describes a conversation he had with a Maidan activist. He asked her what was different this time from 2004, and she replied, "This time, we don't care if Donbass and Crimea are with us." It's worth repeating that, as it sums up so much of what went wrong and why there is a war in Ukraine. This time, we don't care if Donbass and Crimea are with us. The Maidan protests constituted a successful effort to seize power by unconstitutional means by one part of the population without concern for the other part's sentiments. On coming to power, the new government put the same attitude into practice, making it clear that it didn't care what Donbass or Crimea thought. The new government contained nobody who could possibly claim to represent those parts of the country. Nobody from the government visited Donbass to speak to the people there. The government made it clear that it planned to introduce changes it knew were unpopular there. As one of its first steps, the parliament repealed the law giving the Russian language regional official status. The acting president refused to approve this act, but the damage was done. The manner in which the government came to power and then acted initially thus created a crisis of legitimacy. People in the East did not particularly like Yanukovych, but they had voted for him in elections which were internationally considered free and fair. They considered his overthrow illegal and the new government illegitimate. To keep the country together, the new government needed to do something to reassure that part of the population that they had a place in the new order. Unfortunately, it did the opposite. Instead of recognizing that it had a legitimacy problem, it chose to respond to the protests against it with force. On 9th of May, Ukrainian forces entered Mariupol to retake a police station which had fallen under opposition control. On their way back out of town, the Ukrainian soldiers opened fire on civilian protesters, killing at least 9 and wounding about 50. 2 days later, in Krasnoarmeysk, pro-government militiamen seized a polling station being used in the Donetsk referendum. When locals turned up to protest, the militiamen opened fire, killing 2. Almost from its start of its rule, therefore, the Ukrainian government was using lethal force against its own citizens. As time went on, the amount of force being used escalated. In mid-May, the Ukrainian army was shelling Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Before long, it was shelling Donetsk and Lugansk. In the past year, the Ukrainian army has fired thousands of shells into Ukrainian cities. Most of them appear to have landed nowhere near identifiable military targets. I have no evidence that the Ukrainians have deliberately targeted civilians. The problem seems to be more one of inaccuracy and possibly recklessness. The army has fired hundreds of rockets from Grad and Uragan rocket launchers into built-up areas. These are so-called area weapons designed to destroy everything in a wide area rather than to hit a precise target. They are therefore inherently indiscriminate, and inherently indiscriminate weapons are prohibited under the Geneva Conventions in built-up areas. They've also used white phosphorus. White phosphorus is not illegal, contrary to what many people say. However, under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, its use would be illegal where there is a concentration of civilians. So we would then enter into some legal issues about whether the places it was used had a concentration of civilians.
Currently unavailable.
The consequences of the Ukrainian army's actions have been billions of dollars in damage. Furthermore, the Ukrainian army has killed thousands of Ukrainian citizens. The death of 100 people in Kiev is often cited as proof that Yanukovych had lost the right to govern in Kiev. Unfortunately, the new government has killed vastly more people. Its response to this has been simply to deny it. The government denied that its troops killed anybody in Mariupol. When one of its airplanes killed 8 people in Lugansk on the 2nd of June, it made an absurd claim that the deaths were due to a rebel anti-aircraft missile being distracted by an air conditioning unit. Ukrainian army spokesmen have continually denied that their troops shell residential areas. Colonel Lysenko, the spokesman, regularly says this. All such shelling, it is said, is done by the rebels in order to discredit the Ukrainian army. This is simply untrue. The Ukrainian armies
Sorry about that.
Okay, so to go back, I'll give another example of this, actually. If you look up Vice News, which has done some excellent reporting, Simon Ostrovsky in particular, there's just after the Ukrainian army retook Slavyansk, they were about to go in there, and there's this interview of Simon Ostrovsky, the reporter from Vice News, with General Gelete, the then Minister of Defense, in which the general says, "You can see for yourselves that nothing terrible happened in Slavyansk," whereupon the Vice News camera pans along the streets full of destroyed homes and factories. Okay, so unfortunately, okay, the Ukrainian authorities are in a state of total denial about the effects of their actions. They are also in denial about the influence of the far right. I do not for one moment agree with the label given to the government as a fascist junta. Poroshenko, Yatsenuk, and the rest of them are not fascists. But to come to power, they formed an alliance with far-right groups who provided the muscle which enabled them to overthrow Yanukovych. And I've been, even a senior Ukrainian official has admitted to me that without right sector, they'd never have come to power. Okay. Finding then that having come to power, they did not have a reliable army, they then acquiesced in the formation of volunteer battalions and sent them to the front to do their fighting. In the process, they thoroughly tainted their own cause. They seem to have, it seems to me, no understanding that images of Stepan Bandera, the Nazi symbols of the Azov regiment, and so on, are not inventions of Russian propaganda and have had an enormous impact on how the people of Donbass view the new order. Okay? The new government has never once issued a statement disassociating itself from such symbols. It's as if it has a tin ear, a complete unconcern about how it looks to others. To give it another example, 2 days ago, President Poroshenko asked Parliament to declare October the 14th a national holiday, Day of the Defenders of Ukraine. Why October the 14th? Because it's the anniversary of the foundation of the UPA, the Ukrainian army which fought against the Soviets in the Second World War. Now, to many Ukrainians, these are heroic patriots, but to the people of Donbass, they're Nazis. Okay. Now, you might imagine if you have a civil war, what you want to do is to reconcile and to have symbols which unite people. So why would you do this? Either you just don't get it, you don't understand how these things look to other people, or you do understand, and to go back to that quote, you just don't care. But either way, it seems to me you're culpable. So why then has the government acted in this way? Well, part of the problem, I think, lies in that quote about not caring about Donbass. I have observed quite a high level of contempt towards the people of Donbass. It's viewed as a backward, working-class, gangster-ridden enclave stuck in a Soviet mindset. Now, you might say that's true or not, but whether it's true or not is really irrelevant. The pro-Western elites, essentially, they have their idea of what Ukraine needs, and they see no reason to be held back by such a reactionary zone. So from the start, they've been determined to press ahead regardless of what people think. And that has been a major cause of the current disastrous state of affairs. Second, the new government seems really to believe its own propaganda that Maidan represented a popular uprising and the settled will of the vast majority of the people of Ukraine. It has never understood its unpopularity in Donbass. This explains why, for instance, in mid-April, they sent some troops into Kramatorsk and then were utterly shocked when the local people surrounded the troops and disarmed them. And acting President Turchinov said, we didn't expect this to happen, because he simply had no understanding that the people there didn't like the government. Okay? I think they really do believe their own propaganda, and they just don't get that they have a legitimacy problem. Also, the annexation of Crimea played a major role in this, and I think that the Russians have a lot to blame for this, in that by taking over Crimea, they established essentially a victim mentality in Kiev. From that moment on, those in power in Ukraine saw themselves as the victims of Russian aggression, and all their problems as arising from that. That meant that they did not have to think about whether they had done anything wrong themselves. So instead of reconsidering the path down which they were going, they ploughed on regardless, blindly unaware of their own faults. So what about the rebels? Well, the most important thing they've done is rebel. So we don't really need to talk a lot about the what. Initially, the rebellion took the form of seizing a handful of government buildings along with some weapons. When the government sent in the army to restore order, they resisted by force and gradually built up a substantial army of their own. Over time, they have also created the outlines of states. At first, rebel areas were lawless. There were multiple cases of looting, kidnapping, even murder. There is now less of this, as the authorities in Donetsk and Lugansk have begun to centralize authority and exercise some sort of control over society. This has been a slow process, however. The initial uprising was not centrally controlled, but rather the product of local initiatives which led to the creation of multiple militias, each under their own local warlord. It has taken a great deal of time to meld them all together, and this process is still continuing. So why have they rebelled? Well, simply put, they regarded the overthrow of Yanukovych as illegitimate. This led to protests by the more radical elements of the Donbass population. At first, these did not have much support, but events such as the killing of 40 people in Odessa on 2nd of May and the shootings in Mariupol on 9th of May accentuated the dislike of the new authorities and encouraged more and more people to join the rebel cause. The new Ukrainian government's alliance with the far right was also an important factor. Memories of the Great Patriotic War are very strong in Donbass. Symbols which may have an innocent meaning in Western Ukraine are utterly toxic in the East. Fascist symbols are especially toxic. The fact that the Ukrainian government wasn't actually fascist, but had merely allied itself with some people who wandered around with fascist symbols, is a kind of subtle distinction which people with that particular historical memory are not going to get. They simply saw symbols which they associated with Nazism and reacted in a visceral manner. Their cause, though, is largely reactive. It has no ideological unity. The only thing which unites the rebels is that they hate the government in Kiev. When you see rebels being interviewed and they are asked why they took up arms, the answer is nearly always the same. This is my land. I live here. I never asked these people to come here. I am defending my home. That is how they see it. They are defending their homes. It's really that simple, and they say it over and over and over and over again. The rebel army was maybe 2,000 strong in May last year. It was 5,000 strong in June, 10,000 in July, 20,000 in August, maybe 30,000 now. The more violence the Kiev government has used against the rebellion, the more people have flocked to join it. It is important, therefore, to understand the extent to which the rebellion is a reaction against what that government has done. It is common to blame the war on Russian propaganda, which has allegedly brainwashed the people of Donbass. But they haven't needed Russian propaganda to see their cities being shelled and the morgues overflowing. Propaganda only works if it falls on fertile soil. And the reason the soil in Donbass has been so fertile is that the authorities in Kiev have done a really good job in spreading manure. I will finish off then with a few words about the role played by Western states. That role, unfortunately, has not been a positive one. Even before the war, levels of anti-Russian rhetoric in the Western press had reached quite incredible proportions, as seen in the coverage of the Sochi Olympics. For several years, Western states have failed to recognize that Russia of the 2010s is not the Russia of the 1990s, that it is stronger, and that its interests have to be taken more into account, whether you like it or not. Just pure realism suggests it. In the case of Ukraine, it would appear that Western leaders simply failed to consider how important Russians felt the matter to be. One or two Western academics did warn that if the Maidan protests succeeded, they would lead to war. Western leaders, however, just brushed this concern aside. That was a major mistake. I do not believe, to go to a question someone asked in the last session, that Maidan was a Western orchestrated coup led by American puppet masters. On the whole, I think it is best to view the war in Ukraine not as a struggle between Russia and the West. And I think this endless discussion about Russia versus the West is misleading. It's primarily a civil war whose roots are mainly local, but in which foreign powers have meddled. It's what we academics would call an internationalized civil war. So the West did not arrange the overthrow of Yanukovych. It did, however, support it. Western politicians, such as our own John Baird, turned up on Maidan and lent open support to the protests, in effect putting the weight of their countries behind an attempt to topple a democratically elected president. Okay? This was, I believe, extremely irresponsible behavior. Unfortunately, the West's behavior following the overthrow of Yanukovych has not been much better. By focusing all our attention on the alleged malevolence of Russia, we have allowed ourselves to turn a blind eye to the many failings of the government in Kiev. As a result, we have sought to solve the problems solely by means of applying pressure on Russia in the hope of changing Russian behavior. But Ukrainian behavior needs changing too. Yet we have never sought to apply any pressure on Kiev. After Maidan, we should have been telling the new authorities that they had a legitimacy problem and that they needed to do something about it, to bring the people of Donbass into the fold. We should have told them not to send the army into Donbass. We didn't. Instead, we pretty much encouraged every single mistake the Ukrainian government has made. As a result, the West must share some of the blame for what has happened. We have actually very little influence over Russia, and we're kidding ourselves if we think we can really change Russian behavior. By contrast, we do have some influence over Ukraine, which needs our money, if nothing else. So we should start using that influence. And on that point, I conclude.
Dynamite. Okay, thank you so much, Paul. Now we want to turn to Moscow. You're in your basement, is that right?
I am.
All right. This is Fred Weir, everybody. Go for it, Fred.
Okay, well, I will be considerably briefer. I must say that Professor Robinson has covered a lot of the ground that I had thought I'd remark on. But I have covered this part of the world for about 3 decades now. Always based in Moscow all that time, but often traveling to Ukraine. I've traveled all over Ukraine. I am myself of Ukrainian extraction. My grandparents emigrated to Canada from Galicia 110 years ago. So I have this background, and I have been writing for quite a while about how deeply divided a society Ukraine was. It is like 2 different countries stuck together in very realistic way. It's not just language, religion, culture, the pantheon of heroes, all the things that have erupted now in mass violence were present there. And they were not things worth fighting over in the past. I also traveled a great deal in the former Yugoslavia before it exploded. And there was a similar thing there. You know, people had these differences, but they were intermarried. They got along. They had one language, but different religions, different scripts. A lot of little things that you wouldn't think were worth killing over. But then there was breakdown, and terrible violence erupted. And this potential was always there in Ukraine. And what has happened in the past decade and a half, basically a decade, which changed the nature or put new pressures on Ukraine, was that the European Union rolled up to one border, and Russia revived economically, politically. It became a far more assertive force, and this did create a geopolitical dimension to the differences in Ukraine. In the Western Ukraine, of course, they go to work in Poland. They see that in Poland, living standards have improved 2-fold, 3-fold in the last decade, whereas theirs stagnated. They saw the benefits of European Union membership there. But on the other hand, in Eastern Ukraine, they come to Russia as migrant workers. My own son's nanny is from Luhansk, from Krasny Luch, and they have seen that in Russia there is a new order, much better, higher economic standards of living, and this intensified their orientation on Russia, which pre-exists because they watch Russian TV, they speak Russian, they are oriented culturally on Moscow. So in this sense, you know, when journalists use shorthand like pro-Russian and pro-European, it's usually nonsense. But in this case, that dimension is sort of real. The conflict or the differences within Ukraine were internationalized in that way well before the Maidan happened. And I'm going to be a bit argumentative here about the Maidan. I know that Professor Robinson covered this, but I myself had deep misgivings during the Maidan about the way it unfolded, the intense pressure, street occupation of a square, organized violence on the part of protesters, things that would never be tolerated in a Western country, were heroized by us, by a lot of us, and the fact is that Ukrainian politicians came to the Maidan, people like Yatsenyuk and so on. They made deals with the Maidan, which was a powerful, in many ways admirable show of stamina on the part of protesters. But the population of Kiev is 3 million, and there never was anything remotely resembling a majority of Ukrainians represented there. Their spirit, their elan was amazing, but the fact that politicians came and made these deals and began to see a shortcut to power really gave me misgivings even as it was going on, because after all, elections were barely a year away. You know, just about this time, in fact, within a few months of now, if all those events hadn't happened, there would be presidential elections in Ukraine, and Yanukovych could have been removed through the democratic process that did exist in Ukraine. And I have written so many articles. I've covered every Ukrainian election in the last 15 years. And every time I write the stock article about how Ukraine has a democracy, it has a functioning civil society, it has institutions that work more or less. Yes, it's corrupt and it's got a lot of the post-Soviet problems, but it works in that respect, in the sense of openness and fair elections and free speech, far better than Russia. It was this example. And in a lot of ways, the Maidan short-circuited that. And it did create, I know we exempt it from our list of things to blame. And part of the reason what I personally have felt worst about is that we in the West rushed in to validate them. And Professor Robinson said this, and I'm afraid I agree with him. All the principles that we stand for in the West, institutional democracy, elections, all those things, we let it go. And we rushed in to slap their backs and say, we're behind you. And so we do have some of the blame for that. Secondly, about Crimea, I think that Russia made a terrible mistake in doing this. They went a step beyond international law, and they have created a situation that will put Russia at odds with the West for decades to come. And I know all the Russian arguments for it. And I resonate to them even sometimes. I have a very good old friend who is Russian, very high-ranking Russian diplomat these days. He was a young diplomat when I first met him. And I had this discussion with him shortly after the annexation of Crimea. And I said, like, why did you, the lies, the abrupt action, it's clearly like whether or not the majority of the population were behind this, it is a completely off the reservation kind of thing to do. And he said, look, we have been in the room in Europe and the world for the past 15 years. We have watched as the West does all these things, invade Iraq, occupy Afghanistan, how they gave independence to Kosovo. Whenever it's a matter of Western security or Western interests, they rewrite the rules. In Yugoslavia, they made 3 different ethnic groups who'd been slaughtering each other live together in one state in Bosnia, because that was the principle, sovereign states. Then they turned around and detached Kosovo and dismembered a sovereign state. So we've been watching all of this, and we concluded that this is naked geopolitical struggle. They will do what they will do, and we will have to do what we will do. Now, I don't necessarily sign on to that or agree with it, but I do understand that the Russians have been progressively isolated and alienated from the West over the past 15 years. I have sort of covered that on a more or less week-to-week basis. All the things that they are told you do or don't do in the 21st century, they have seen the West violate it. Even as we speak right now, the West is supporting an insurrection in Syria, cross-border volunteers, arms, training, rebels, doing all of that. And yet they turn around and say to Russia, you're completely, like you're from a different planet. So the Russians have been alienated, and this is not just their fault. They're to blame for annexing Crimea, and this will be a big problem for decades to come. But the fact that world order has been ruptured and the idea of a rules-governed world order doesn't work is not completely down to Russia. They are reacting in some ways. They're making up rules in annexing Crimea. They certainly did. But there is blame on our side as well. And thirdly, about the anti-terrorist operation, this too, I had severe misgivings. I don't believe that Putin says that the United States advised and organized this, that came and told the Ukrainians you should crush this rebellion with military force. That's what Putin says. But we did, and the West did, endorse it after it started happening. And I have covered two Russian wars in Chechnya, and I never accepted the Russian rationale for what they were doing. To make war on one of your own republics and your own people, bomb their cities, shell them, always seemed to me counterproductive. I never accepted it. I covered it with the deepest critical attitude, and I'm still deeply critical. I think that Chechnya is a mess. It's a time bomb within the heart of Russia because of what they did. Even though it had been occupied by separatists and they were posing a serious challenge, I always thought there were political approaches that they might be long and hard, but that they should have been used, and that the Russians they behaved like 900-pound gorillas, and Russia will continue to pay the price for that. So I don't really understand why so many of my colleagues accept that there is no alternative in Ukraine to launching a military operation. And I don't understand why that is such an accepted narrative in the West. I have thought all along that there should have been an outreach after the Maidan. If that happened, and Yanukovych did flee spontaneously, they needed to develop approaches that stressed political methods in the first place. I traveled to Ukraine in the last year 4 times, and mostly to Kiev and to government-controlled areas in eastern Ukraine. I don't cover the war, not directly, but I have a lot of very good friends and colleagues who are doing that, and I talk a lot with them. My own impression was from the very beginning, after the Maidan, that there was great disquiet in the East. Most of the East people didn't feel like rising up, but they were not comfortable or happy with what had happened. They were not on side with the Maidan. And polls, including Gallup polls and polls by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, showed very clearly that while 2/3 of people east of the Dnieper and in the south did want to continue living in a united Ukraine, they also showed that 2/3 plus of people in those regions considered the Kiev government to be illegitimate. And therefore, that was a political problem, but not an irresolvable one. It wasn't as though people wanted to join Russia. It was that they felt deep disquiet about what had happened. They needed a political process to reconcile them. And there should have been one, an anti-oligarch, anti-corruption. A lot of the slogans of the Maidan, I think, would be well received in eastern Ukraine, but that was never tried. And hence we have a military option. Now it's reached, hopefully it's at an end. But if you follow the reporting of so many of my colleagues who are there, even now in Donbass, you'll find that increasingly they stress that even if people were ambivalent a year ago, they are now staunchly against Kiev. The shelling, the killing has turned them against Kiev, and that's now mainstream reporting. I'm afraid that what has happened is final and irreversible, and that we're headed for the breakup of Ukraine. And I think the blame for that goes all around.
Thank you. Thank you. Not exactly an encouraging analysis, but one we certainly need to hear. Thank you so much. Borys, you want to sit where you are to...
Yes, I'd have to ask your indulgence. I had a knee operation a couple of weeks ago, so it's a little difficult to stand for 20 minutes. If I could stay at the table. And if that wasn't encouraging, what I'm about to say is probably even less so. The odds are increasing. They're still minor odds, but the odds are increasing that a decade from now, historians and panels such as this one may well be analyzing how a Third World War began. And if so, they may well point to November of 2013 and the Euromaidan, the Ukrainian Revolution for Dignity, as the starting point. What that means is that without most of us realizing it, we may well be in the first stages of a horrific and great war. The decisions that Western political leaders, including Canada's, make in the coming months will determine if in fact this is the case. I've opened with this statement to underline the potential existentialist threat that Russia's war of aggression, and I believe in calling things by their names, against Ukraine today not only poses a threat to Ukraine's nascent statehood and embrace of liberal democracy and the rule of law, but also an existentialist threat to the relative, and I use the term relative, peaceful world order established in the past several decades based on and upon the rules of international treaties and agreements. And all of these things are not black and white. There are shades of gray. However, a century ago, no one could imagine that the Franco-Prussian border, the most militarized border on the planet, would one day cease to exist other than on maps. What would be truly astounding to our great-grandparents would be that this was achieved through peace, international agreements, and not war and annexations. Simply put, it appeared that the pen, international agreements, was mightier than the sword. Military divisions and equipment. It really seems that until recently, the lessons of two great wars begun on the European continent had been learned. It appeared so until the spring of 2015, when after the flame of the Sochi Olympics was extinguished, Russian dictator, and let's call him by what he is, Vladimir Putin, militarily invaded and annexed Crimea on the false pretext of ethnic grievances. Something we had not seen on the European continent since the 1930s. Today we see horrific images of death and destruction in the geographic center of Europe. Over 5,000 dead, mostly civilians, and the number most likely is closer to 10,000 dead. And with over 1.5 million refugees. This is already not just a Ukrainian, but a European humanitarian catastrophe. Yet a Russian spring offensive, should it happen, could quickly mean 50, perhaps 100,000 dead in Ukraine, and millions of refugees escaping westward into Western Europe. The geopolitical danger we face for a peaceful world order makes it incumbent upon us to provide clarity through the fog of disinformation emanating from the Kremlin, and to counter the lack of knowledge and instinctive isolationism that we often encounter in the West. To better understand who's done what and why, the parameters of this particular panel, I'll be making two assertions in regards to the current dismemberment of the Ukrainian state. My first assertion: by the spring of 1990, the KGB and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union realized that one of the scenarios that may play out in the near future would be the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of its republics. Planning began for this potential eventuality and its consequent scenarios. In regards to Ukraine, as early as 1991, one of the planned for scenarios in case of Ukraine's independence was civil war and the establishment of a series of autonomous republics in its place. Republics which would eventually join the Russian Federation. My second assertion is that Putin began planning for the annexation of Crimea soon after Ukraine's Orange Revolution in 2004. Now, these assertions are based on my personal experiences and observations in the Donbass region and in Crimea, beginning in 1990, and through friendships and conversations with key players local in those regions and national in Ukraine during this time frame. So back to assertion number one. A KGB and FSB Kremlin-organized civil war in Ukraine. In 1990, I first traveled into the Donbass region, a mostly closed to Westerners region of Soviet Ukraine, for the 500th anniversary of so-called Cossack Glory. It was the first such celebration in the region. Considering that this was an historical celebration, I was astounded by the lack of historical memory or knowledge amongst the general population compared to Central Ukraine and especially compared to Western Ukraine. Cities such as Luhansk were depressingly gray, Stalinist in architecture. Unlike Western Ukraine's villages and countryside, where churches, although shuttered and in ruins or functioning as museums of atheism, stood as reminders of a previous era and its sets of values, the Donbass countryside was devoid of these historical, architectural, and archival reminders. Stalin's demolition program of dynamiting in the Donbass had succeeded. The Donbass was a paysage of ecological suffering of vast coal mining enterprises and slag heaps competing with the region's pastoral natural beauty. However, what was most disturbing was something I had not previously encountered. For the average person in the Donbass, history seemed to begin in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. In local libraries, there were tomes and rack after rack of Soviet history books and Soviet achievements, reams of anti-capitalist, anti-American, especially propaganda, yet virtually no pre-1917 history books. What was also astounding was that amongst the older generation of ethnic Ukrainians, most did not know who their grandparents were. That was lost in the mists of time. Stalin's Holodomor, famine genocide, which had hit the Donbass region particularly hard, had done its work. The few survivors of that era and their children and subsequent generations learned that taking an interest in the black vacuum of history was dangerous and lethal. To try to comprehend this, the equivalence would be imagining if the Pol Pot had actually taken over Kampuchea. What would be the historical memory of the survivors 3 generations on? Through my travels and engagements in the Soviet Union, I became convinced of its imminent collapse and the independence of Ukraine. However, the informational black void in the Donbass left me with a feeling of foreboding. In the summer of 1991, on the 100th anniversary of the arrival of the first Ukrainian immigrants to Canada, I returned with a group of Ukrainian-Canadian students and young professionals to extend a hand of friendship from the West. We not only wished to counter the ingrained anti-Western propaganda, we were there to share our experiences and ideas. We brought Russian and Ukrainian translations of Canada's Charter of Rights, our policies of multiculturalism. We traveled throughout Luhansk, visiting many towns. Today, I read about many of the towns we visited and see scenes of unimaginable destruction. During those 2 particular weeks of travels, there were stretches where a day did not go by that as our group's leader, I wasn't taken in, mind you, it wasn't really arrested, but taken in for questioning. Usually the police would arrive at our hotel or be waiting for our arrival at the train station, or I'd be taken away once we would set up an informational table in town square. Mostly I'd be questioned by local first secretaries of the Communist Party, or local police chiefs, or civilian-clothed men who everyone else in the room would defer to, and I would assume were local KGB. These so-called conversations would range from friendly, party first secretaries offering shots of brandy, to surreal, with a mind complex union leader smashing his chair against the wall above my head. However, what I found most unsettling was something else. Although the average person in the Donbass could not imagine anything besides the Soviet Union, first secretaries and civilian-clothed KGB questioners in various towns, when discussing the future, referred to Krivoriysko-Donetska Autonomna Respublika, Novorossiyska Autonomous Region, the Crimean Autonomous Republic, Zakarpatska Autonomna Respublika. In fact, in 2 different meetings in 2 different towns, the same map of Ukraine as a small rump state with these autonomous republics was shown to me. And once again, this is the summer of 1991.
Wow.
Yet when I mention the concepts of these autonomous republics, to the average person, I was met with blank stares, except in one case. In Luhansk city, we were told about the arrival of a group of Russian Don Cossacks. Our guide was leery of this group. However, I was curious and approached one of them, offering $10 US for a memento from his uniform, a souvenir hammer and sickle. He turned out to actually be a pretty chatty type, who after receiving the $10 bill, started talking at one point of establishing a Krivorийsko-Donetska Autonomna Respublika. And when I asked about formal military training, because these were supposedly Don Cossacks, he mentioned the Soviet 14th Army Division. This is the infamous division which went on to establish the autonomous Transnistria mafia state, which is at the center of much of Europe's arms smuggling, human smuggling, and various other corrupt structures. Over the subsequent years, I had a number of projects, some financed by the Ukrainian Canadian diaspora, others self-financed, based in Luhansk, all geared to bringing knowledge and information, light into the darkness of the region's historical informational void, and to counter a Kremlin narrative that could potentially lead to war. In fact, in 1992, along with a small group of volunteers, and with Canada's first ambassador to Ukraine, Francois Matisse, we officially opened Luhansk Oblast's first Ukrainian and English language library attached to Luhansk's Pedagogical University. There were thousands of books on history, economics, and political science. The library became not only a place for study and research for the university, it became a cultural center, the place where the Luhansk Writers' Union met, the place for meetings of the Shevchenko Society, the place where students even learned certain things like embroidering. It was also the first place where what had been the underground and illegal Greek Catholic Church was allowed to have its first meetings. Today, that library no longer exists, and it's been reported to me that its thousands of books have disappeared. Several days ago, this past week, Dmitry Muratov, the editor of one of Russia's few remaining independent newspapers, Novaya Gazeta, made what many found to be an astounding assertion, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was not a reaction to ethnic threats or a fascist coup in Kyiv, but in fact was pre-planned. He stated that he has official documents prepared between February 4th and February 15th of 2014 planning for the invasion and annexation of 9 oblasts, regions of East and South Ukraine. This was while Yanukovych was still president and before the shootings on the Maidan. As well, this coming week, we can also expect documents to be made public by Ukraine's Prosecutor General, which detail President Putin's aide, Vladislav Surkov, as being in charge of Russian sniper units in Kyiv in February of 2014. Although editor Muratov's documents assert that Russia's plans to militarily invade Ukraine were formulated in early February of last year, it's clear to me that this is just the most recent version of the Kremlin's plans to militarily invade Ukraine. Plans that could be found in the bowels of the KGB and successor FSB from at least as early as 1991. Now I'd like to move on to my second assertion that Putin began planning for the annexation of Crimea soon after Ukraine's Orange Revolution. My wife's family are from Crimea, and every summer we would take our children to visit their grandmother, their great-grandmother, their aunts and uncles and cousins in Crimea. We wanted them to know their Crimean family. And I'm not much of a beach goer. So when the family would spend their days on the beach, I'd go inland. And there are two Crimeas. The coastal, touristy Crimea, and then the rest of the inland of Crimea. And I enjoy talking with people and asking questions. And I pretty quickly learned of the great and deep Russian resentment that existed in Crimea towards the Crimean Tatar population in particular. This wasn't uniform. However, there was this tremendous resentment towards the Crimean Tatars, and in many cases also to Ukrainian statehood. And even though most of these Russians were transplanted, or the children of transplanted former Soviet army officers from all parts of the Soviet Union, there was a collective cohesion and consciousness amongst them, notwithstanding where they came from, that was based on the Russian military and the supposed glory days of the Russian military. I also got to know Crimean Tatars, and through friendships that I developed, was eventually introduced to their leader, Mustafa Dzhemiliev, the head of the Crimean Tatar Majlis, a man who spent some 18 years in Soviet prison camps fighting for the right of the Crimean Tatars to return to their ancestral homeland, and the man who led his people back to Crimea. In the summer of 2010, I became aware of a couple things that were particularly disturbing. In a conversation with Mr. Dzhemiliev, I learned that he'd been warned by Ukraine's services that he was one of the individuals targeted for assassination on a list that they had acquired. And the previous year, at that time, Ukraine's president, or a couple of years prior, President Yushchenko had expelled several Russian diplomats. The story never fully came out, but apparently these diplomats were financing cultural organizations in Odessa, places in the south, and in Crimea. It turned out they were also financing what had potentially been an assassination squad. I also became aware of these so-called youth cultural camps, where young boys in Crimea were being indoctrinated with hatred, while at the same time being trained to use weaponry, Kalashnikovs. And in 2010, while we were there, billboards began appearing, first on the major highways of Crimea, and all of them were uniform in their messaging. And it wasn't even so subliminal. It was pretty clear. It was a billboard of a young, maybe 16, 17-year-old, blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy in fatigues with a Kalashnikov. The backdrop was a Russian Imperial Eagle in attack mode, and there was one word, unity, meaning unity with Russia. And interestingly, The group that was financing this was called Russkie Единство. Initially, it was just along major highways, but over the course of the next few weeks, they started appearing everywhere. So I took the time to investigate who was this Russkie Единство. And it turned out that there was a man by the name of Aksionov, a transplanted ethnic Russian from Transnistria, Moldova, who was engaged in cigarette smuggling and other sort of corrupt schemes. And it appeared that his organization was financing all of this. That's when I decided to bring Mr. Dzhemiliev to Canada to speak and meet with members of Canada's Parliament. And it was at that time, as mentioned in the program booklet, that I first started asserting that one of the most dangerous geopolitical fault lines on the Eurasian landmass runs through Ukraine and lands in Crimea, and that's where the next major geopolitical crisis will begin. And I was called alarmist at that time. So I engaged Professor Robert Magocsi from the University of Toronto to write a book, once again in the hopes of, at least in a small way, contributing in a positive way to write a book about Crimea and the Crimean Tatars, to counter the Russian propaganda that this is historical, sacred Russian land. The book came out last spring. And what's quite clear is Russia has militarily occupied Crimea for about 160 years, off and on. But the Crimean Tatars, it's been their homeland for over half a millennium. And Crimea has been part of Ukraine for some 60-odd years. And Crimea's indigenous peoples are the Crimean Tatars, who wish to see their Crimea as a part of Ukraine. The book launch was supposed to happen on the 70th anniversary of the mass deportation of Crimean Tatars in Bakhchisarai, their ancestral ancient capital, and then in Kyiv. Unfortunately, by May, Putin had invaded and annexed Crimea. Mr. Dzhemiliev once again finds himself banned from visiting his ancestral homeland, just as in Soviet times, as most of the Crimean Tatar leadership. So in conclusion, I return to my opening remarks. President Putin, who has transformed Russia's nascent democracy into a kleptocratic dictatorship with oligarchic state capitalism, has begun his and the FSB's long plan for military invasion and subjugation of Ukraine. If Ukraine were to become a successful liberal democracy, it becomes a dual threat, as seen from the Kremlin. A threat to Putin's dictatorial political system and to the dream of a resurgent Russian Empire. A Putinist, chauvinistic, and neo-imperialistic ideology which envisions a third Russian Empire, which reabsorbs not only regions with Russian speakers, but also so-called lost and historical Russian territories. In Kremlin ideological circles, the West, with its chaotic democratic systems and immoral liberalism, is seen as the ultimate threat to be dealt with if Russia is to resume its historic destiny of becoming a supreme global power. The first step on this path is for Ukraine's statehood and democracy to be dismantled. Plan A was to achieve this through a puppet kleptocratic regime, the Yanukovych scenario. Then there was Plan B, the federalization of Ukraine. Fortunately, that Congress in Kharkiv fell apart. And finally, should Plan A and B fail, Plan C, the hybrid military invasion of Ukraine. Unfortunately, Putin's and FSB's plans, or fortunately, A, B, and C have all failed to date due to one factor: the hard will of the Ukrainian people to live in independence and freedom. For the first time in the European Union's history, people have died while carrying the EU flag and the values it symbolizes. That happened on the Maidan during Ukraine's Revolution for Dignity. Ukrainians laid down their lives for these liberal democratic values. Today, Ukraine's poorly armed volunteer battalions have been largely responsible in defeating one of the planet's largest and best equipped conventional forces using so-called hybrid war methods. Instead of militarily severing the 8 planned-for provinces of Novorossiya, Russia's hybrid war has been confined to a rump of Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. This notwithstanding the fact that, as the U.S. ambassador pointed out last week, that there are more and more modern arms in the misnomered Donetsk People's Republic and LPR than in a number of NATO countries. Ironically, thousands of Ukrainian volunteer soldiers have in this last year laid down their lives as a shield, not only for Ukraine, but indirectly as a shield for NATO member countries and their democracies. Unfortunately, recent history has shown Putin is not one to accept defeat, and Ukraine and the West will be facing new challenges. It's time to provide Ukraine's army with defensive lethal weapons so that Ukraine can deter the next military escalation that the Kremlin is planning for. In 1994, at that time, the world's 3rd largest nuclear power gave up over 1,200 nuclear weapons for the sake of world peace, and in return for guarantees of her territorial integrity by the United States and Great Britain. Today, Ukraine is asking for, and so far not receiving, 1,200 anti-tank and anti-aircraft systems to prevent the further territorial dismemberment. What country watching Ukraine's dismemberment would agree to nuclear non-proliferation or nuclear disarmament negotiations today? Ironically, by not providing Ukraine's army with defensive lethal weapons to counter Putin's conventional forces, a peaceful world order based upon international agreements and commitments becomes a historical relic. Thank you.
Thank you, Borys. Well, I promised people that we would have a diversity of perspectives, and I think I delivered, right? This particular session really spanned the spectrum. All right. Okay, back to order. Here we go. While these gentlemen are doing their job, sorting these cards, I will ask Fred, would you, do you have any thoughts, any responses to either of the other two presenters here? If so, let yourself go.
About Crimea, I do have an observation, and I have also followed Crimea for quite a long time, and I know that the majority of the population there, I mean, quite 2/3 majority are ethnic Russians. A much bigger swath of them are completely Russified, and they're independently of what the KGB was thinking. I know that for these past 2.5 decades, they were thinking that they'd rather be in Russia. In fairness,
who was thinking? I'm
the
sorry,
the majority population of Crimea.
majority in Crimea.
And
Yeah.
and in fairness too, Ukraine never did much for them. Like much of Ukraine, it languished. While, as I said, in Russia, in the Putin era, living standards rose. An order, a Russian pride, whatever you want to call it, did take hold. And so it's not in Crimea, which is quite distinct from eastern Ukraine, from the Donbass even. There was I think, they declared independence in 1991. They were strong-armed back into Ukraine, actually by Boris Yeltsin. So I think that although Russia did it in a deceitful and deeply illegal way, the Russians were pushing on an open door. And I do know too, or I'm pretty sure I know, that Russia probably had contingency plans for annexing the Crimea since about 2008. The last time that NATO membership for Ukraine was on the table, and I think this is mainly in the Russian mind. All the Russians I talk to, it's NATO, which they see as the threat. This comes from the depths of Russian historical perception, but it's also about Sevastopol. I think that this idea that is a major Russian naval base, the fear that it could become a NATO naval base if Ukraine joined NATO is pretty strong. All these are in the Russian mind, and I was told as I was covering the story back just before 2008. There was that Bucharest summit, which took NATO membership for Ukraine off the table at that time and diffused that issue. But Russian experts close to the Kremlin were saying, if that NATO membership for Ukraine is a red line for us, and if it happens, we will do things like in Crimea and so on. So I believe that in that respect, Borys's point probably has some traction. The Russians did have contingency plans, and it did come off so smoothly when they did do it last March. It was completely bloodless. They mobilized crowds of people to surround Ukrainian army bases. I mean, there were 18,000 Ukrainian troops on the peninsula and not one casualty. It's clear that the population was behind them, that it was organized by the Russians. And this is part of the problem, the dilemma that is Crimea now. When Ukrainians say, we're going to get it back, I don't in any way advocate what the Russians did. I don't in any way see how it is reversible.
I'm going to do something different here, if I may. Boris, do you want to, is
Sure.
there a hot pursuit question here?
No, it's not a hot pursuit, but
Okay.
To provide clarity, because it's generally correct what Mr. Weir has stated, but it's also imprecise in some important ways. During Ukraine's referendum for independence in 1991, Crimea actually voted by a margin of 52%. 54%, sorry. I'm glad that someone's actually being exactly precise, for Ukraine's independence. And until the annexation of Crimea, the largest percent of people that agreed to separate from Ukraine in polling that had taken place was 44%. And this is where the precision numbers is quite important. Mr. Weir said that 66% or more are ethnic Russians. In fact, those numbers aren't quite correct. The numbers of Crimean Tatars are quite significantly understated, and the number of ethnic Russians is probably closer to 60%. But what the previous numbers speak to is that not all ethnic Russians in Crimea uniformly, although a majority of the ethnic Russians are happy about this annexation of Crimea, not a majority. And no polling up to the point of annexation had ever shown a majority interested in separation from Ukraine or in joining Russia. And just as a small aside, but it's once again, it's a little vignette that speaks to some of these things. In 2005, I was an OSCE observer for the Ukrainian elections in Crimea and in Sevastopol. There were many abuses of the process. But one of the things that I found most astounding was that in a number of the polls, I would observe people line up to vote, and this was a Ukrainian election, and they were lined up with their Russian passports. So in the first case that I saw this, I waited and I observed over and over people with Russian passports actually going up and being crossed off lists. So they were actually on voters' lists. And when I pointed it out to the electoral officials, some seemed stunned, some seemed a little intimidated by the fact that this was being brought up and this could actually get them in trouble with some of the other people on the electoral commissions. But it spoke to the way the democratic process and elections were observed in Crimea. There was no qualm on the side of Russian Navy officers and their families to actually vote in another country's election. And the local officials were often too intimidated to actually do anything about it. So there's, like I said, it's an interesting vignette to what life was like in Crimea.
Thank you very much. Now, I think Paul has something more to say, a different angle. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about military contingency plans as a former military staff officer. As a former military staff officer, I thought I'd say something about military contingency plans. Military has contingency plans for all sorts of things. It doesn't mean that any politician has the slightest intention to do any of them. Before World War II, Canada had contingency plans to invade the United States. We did. It's quite a notorious one, actually. It didn't mean that the Canadian government had any intention whatsoever of invading the United States. Military officers and military staff officers are not politicians. They do not make political decisions. What they do is they sit around in an office and they dream up potential scenarios which their politicians might one day ask them to do. And when they work out, because they're how people, military people, they're how people rather than why people. Okay, so they just say, well, how would we do it? Right? So they think, well, you know, if we have a war with the United States, how would we do it? And then you draw up a plan. So yes, you know, the guys in the general staff in Russia, you know, they'll think, well, you know, maybe one day there'll be some problems in Ukraine. So what would we do about it? How would we deal with it? And then they draw up a contingency plan. It does not mean that there's some secret government plan to invade Crimea or to invade Ukraine or anything like that at all. Okay? It's just they're thinking, well, it is possible that one day we're going to have a war with Ukraine, that something's going to go horribly wrong, and we've got to think about what we would do were that to happen. And then you draw up a plan. And that's all it means. It's not a sign of any intent politically.
What I would like to know is, have they also got a contingency plan for what they will do after they disarm all the nuclear weapons in the world? Why not a contingency plan for that?
Why? Because they're military people and they kind of like their bombs. So that's probably right, you know.
That's what I was afraid of. Okay, that's a good answer. Fred, do you want to add anything quickly before I actually use one of these cards on people?
Really quick last note on Crimea. I do remember the year 1991 very well. In April of that year, there was a referendum sponsored by Gorbachev in which 76% of all Ukrainians said they wanted to remain within the USSR. By September, 90% of them voted for independence. There was a euphoria. It was after the putsch. It was a strange time. And public moods swung wildly. And I'm surprised then that the figure 54% in Crimea, when 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence, but only 54% of Crimeans did. I think that there is your significant point.
Okay. I have one thing I want to do. Valerie, let's do it right now, okay? It's Valerie there, isn't it? All right. Valerie got home last night from Moscow, and I spoke to her this morning. This is Valerie Wrzesnewskyj, who's a professor at Western. And I don't know, can you take 3, 4, or 5 minutes, not more than 5, to tell us what you were telling me this morning about the attitudes that you discovered about sanctions, etc.?
Well, thank you. I didn't expect to do this right now, and I'm still a little bit jet-lagged. But first of all, I would like to say thank you very much to the panelists. I found everything you said very interesting, all three of you. And as I've just returned from Moscow myself and was working at the higher school, of economics in Moscow, speaking to colleagues there, and observing firsthand the media and people's reactions. The first thing I want to say, which surprised me very much, is that many Russians are quite opposed to the violence, and that doesn't surprise me, but they're very opposed to the aggression into Ukraine. But what surprised me is that there is not an anti-Ukrainian feeling among my colleagues and Russian people in general. What predominates is an anti-Americanism and this feeling that this is an American intervention and that the Americans have a lot to do with this, along with NATO. And some of the major newspapers, and I actually have the article with me if you'd like to see, there's a cartoon of Obama, and there's not a cartoon, a photograph of Obama, which has been doctored a little bit, and a photograph of somebody Jewish looking with a Ukraine cap. So there's that indication. And the second one is that many Muscovites do not connect the sanctions against Russia with the war in Ukraine. There seems to be this disconnect, that they see this as part of an American agenda and not so much as a reaction to the war, which is unfortunate because we would like them to understand the connection so that they would put pressure on their government to make a change. And I'm not sure if that's been something that, probably it's the framework of the Russian government casting this image to the people themselves. And
Okay, thank you.
oh,
That's great.
okay.
Not many of you sitting there in the audience, if I pointed a finger at you, would be able to stand up and do that, right? Okay. So thank you for being able to wing it that way, Valerie. First question here is the question, next steps, especially from the first two speakers, since we have heard next steps from the eloquent third speaker. Okay, so Fred, give us your notion. Oh, this is John Polanyi's comment. Very good, John. I kind of can imagine what's going through your mind about what you thought of the third speaker's proposals. Anyway, Fred.
Okay, well, I think that the chances for political settlement are greater than they have been. This is a war that will go on, and it is overwhelmingly, for the most part, a civil war, and neither side is prepared. Neither Kiev nor these rebels are prepared to compromise fundamentally. I think in Kiev the idea is clearly we will crush them. We will restore constitutional order over this entire territory. Maybe we'll have to take it in 2 or 3 bites. The last time I was in Kiev, everyone was talking about the Croatia scenario. If you remember, in 1995, Croatia had its independence, but it had this Serbian mini-state on one end. Croatia allowed that to continue. They were rearmed by the West, and after 3 years, with at least tacit Western support, they moved in and swept that little state away. I think this is the idea in Kiev. We'll get stronger, and we'll eventually wipe them out or defeat them. As far as I know, and I talk to people in Donbass often by telephone, their idea is independence. And many people say, and even if you read the reporting of my colleagues, increasingly they're reporting voices from the streets there in Donetsk and Luhansk saying, we cannot live with them anymore. After what has happened, we will want to be independent. So what has changed, though, is that there is a focusing of minds in the West, at least in Europe. And I do believe in Russia they don't want to annex the Donbass. They would rather have a Ukraine that is more congenial to Russia. I think this would be the idea, that they would want a Ukraine that is non-aligned and federalized to an extent that has enough autonomy for its eastern provinces, which are more Russian oriented, that Ukraine would remain a buffer zone, maybe like a Finlandized territory between East and West. I think Russia would settle for that. They would have settled for that probably a year ago. But it now remains to be seen whether Moscow and Berlin and Paris can put enough pressure on their respective clients to make them accept that you need this disengagement, which apparently is going forward now, disengagement of heavy artillery and heavy weaponry. And you need political steps to follow. Elections in the Donbass that will be recognized by Kiev and create representatives whom Kiev can talk to, will talk to, and then some kind of constitutional process of change that will create the compromises, at least some kind of compromises, that the sponsors in Moscow and Europe can more or less force both sides to accept. I think there's hope for that, because the fighting has been atrocious. And unlike in Croatia, Russia is not Serbia. I don't think that scenario can ever play out. So therefore, there has to be a political settlement. The outlines of it have been obvious for a long time, and I think we should just all hope it will go forward.
Thank you. Well, that's one of the few notes of hope that I have heard in the last few minutes. Paul, your turn. Okay. What are the next steps? And first of all, I want to know whether you're talking about wishful, what you think would be nice next steps, or what you think really is going to happen. Okay.
I'll do it first. What not to do, and then what to do. How about that? So what not to do is do what Borys here says, and send weapons to Ukraine. You can regard the Ukrainian army as a sort of conduit of weapons to the rebel army. Okay, if you want to give weapons to the rebel army, give them to the Ukrainian army. I'm afraid to say this is sadly the case. I've just been seeing pictures of the enormous volumes of equipment the rebels have captured at Debaltseve from the Ukrainian army. It's quite staggering. Among them is an American lightweight counter-mortar radar system, which was provided to the Ukrainian army about 2 months ago by the Americans. It's already in rebel hands. Okay. Why is this the case? The sad truth is that the Ukrainian army is very badly led. Its problems do not derive from either a lack of weapons or from poor training, but from very poor strategic decisions. And no amount of training or technology can make up for poor performance at the higher strategic level. That arming them is not going to do any good. And as one of my colleagues has said, Russia can always out-escalate the West on this one. If we escalate, they escalate more, and everything just gets worse. So what should we do? Well, I mean, Fred, I think, rightly points out that a lot of people in Donbass do not want to live in Ukraine anymore. And the rebel leaders have made this very clear. But it's very noticeable in the last week or two, they've become a little bit more emollient. So Plotnitsky, the head of Lugansk People's Republic, has been saying stuff about, well, you know, it depends what sort of Ukraine it is. You know, and you know, not the current Ukraine, but a future Ukraine. And if we can have constitutional reform, and that won't be the same Ukraine. So why is he saying this? Why is he saying the opposite of what they've been saying recently? Well, because Moscow's making them say it. Okay, because Moscow wants them to settle. Okay, and Moscow wants it to come to an end, and Moscow is pressuring them to settle. Okay, but they'll only settle on their own terms, and this is where we have to be realist. Okay, now the Minsk Agreement says that there must be constitutional amendment in Ukraine, which must be done not unilaterally by the Ukrainian government, but in consultation with the representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk. Now that is a very loose phrasing and leaves a lot of latitude for the Ukrainian government to decide who are the representatives of Lugansk and Donetsk. And my fear is what the Ukrainian government will do is say that the leaders of the DPR and the LPR are not the representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk, and therefore we don't have to talk with them, and we can negotiate a constitutional amendment with our representatives in Donetsk and Lugansk. If they do that, it will not work, because it will not be accepted by the people it has to be accepted by. And even if it sticks in your gullet and you regard these people as criminals or whatever, the fact is they're the people you have to negotiate with in order to have a peace. It cannot be done without bringing them on board. It simply cannot be done. Okay? Unless you get Plotnitsky and Zakharchenko to sign up to whatever constitutional amendment is done, it will not succeed. So that means that the only way to get an agreement is to go forward with what was laid out in the Minsk Agreement, which is constitutional negotiations with the representatives of Lugansk and Donetsk, which must include, it does not need to be exclusively, but it must include the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And then it is possible, because the Russians are pushing them to deal, that they might actually deal. I think it's a very, very long shot, but it's the only shot we've got. And that's why I think it has to be pursued, because in the end, matters of principle, I'm afraid, are much less important than matters of peace. Thousands and thousands of people are dying, and if this continues, thousands more people will die. And at this point, peace is really what matters more than anything else.
I want to add one point on that. You mentioned the importance of the kind of constitution that gets developed. During the lunch hour, Peter Russell took some people to the gallery grill and talked. Did it work? You had your conversation about constitutional reform in Ukraine?
I think people are solid. You like Paul's thinking.
All right. Okay, you like Paul's thinking. Well, now that's why I want to point this out. There's not going to be a speaker on this topic here, but what is happening that I want to call your attention to is that after this conference, we obviously do not need the page on the Science for Peace website that advertises the conference. It's over. We will convert that page, starting, I guess, tomorrow, to a place where comments will be. You can write your comments. And you can write anything you want as long as it's decent and not abusive. You can take all the space you want, and I hope people will actually engage in the kind of dialogue that I'm sure you would love to be able to have. And one of the things I encourage is if Peter can put up on that page a statement or two about the kinds of notions suggestions you have about the kind of Ukrainian constitution that might be viable. Would you be willing to do a little bit on that?
I'll speak to my friend.
Speak to your friends about it.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, just say one more thing on that. I mean, I don't think that these kind of things are impossible. Like the Ukrainian government has said, it will not allow federalization, it will not allow autonomy. Okay, well, fine. I mean, that seems on the surface an utter barrier to any progress. But then, you know, United Kingdom, where I've spent a lot of my life, is a unitary state, legally. But it has autonomous, well, they're not called autonomous regions, and it's not federal regions, but they actually have structures which are, in effect, you know, federal structures. So it should not actually be impossible to work out something.
But it doesn't have
the
a
Ukrainian government to
okay.
say, we have not granted autonomy, we do not have a federal structure, but in practice does that. But it needs the will, and part of the problem is so far we've seen no will from the Ukrainian government for this. But
Okay.
unless we, and I think the role of the West should be to push the Ukrainian government to make a deal of that sort.
Thank you. Okay.
Metta,
we've
could I
exhausted-
jump in?
Somebody else? Yes.
Yes.
Sure,
yes.
Boris.
I want to return to a couple comments that Professor Robinson made when he tried to dismiss the fact that as far back as 1991, plans could have been put into place for military invasion, war, annexations of Ukraine. And using the example that Canada's military had plans for Canada's invasion of the US. But you actually touched on something that is quite important. The politicians make those decisions. And no Canadian politician would ever make that decision to invade the US. It's not part of our political culture. Canada doesn't invade countries, or it has been until the recent past, Mr. Harper, but it's not part of our, but invading the United States.
Okay.
Russia has Putin as their president. This is the man that began that horrific Chechen war, the Second Chechen War. He has no qualms in using those scenarios. It's part of his personal makeup, and it also is a part of Russian political culture. And it's something that we need to take into account because it's a very dangerous characteristic of Russian political culture. And in those negotiations, we have to take that into account. And how do you handle politicians that see it as legitimate once they no longer need an agreement, that it can be set aside and they can use military means to achieve their objectives? And the other point to this is, it wasn't, you know, you said Canada's chief of staff or whatever, they had this scenario played out. In Luhansk, at that time, these were small town local first party secretaries or local KGB. This was a plan that wasn't kept under wraps somewhere in a file in the Kremlin or in the KGB offices. This was already a plan that had been disseminated through the hierarchical structures of the KGB and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union right down to a regional level. So the comparison does not hold. And the scenario was a real scenario, and it has real consequence. And then just quickly, I actually agree with Mr. Weir about the odds of a political settlement are greater today than they have been in the recent past. The odds of a full-out invasion by Russia were probably much greater a year ago. Half a year ago, they were greater than they are today, and a year ago, they were probably the greatest. But there's also, and it was interesting that Obama was mentioned. Putin also sees Obama's presidency as a window of opportunity, notwithstanding the sort of vile characterizations of President Obama and his blackness. that you see regularly. But in the Kremlin, Putin is conscious of the fact that the next US president, whether Democrat or Republican, will most likely take a much less pacifist approach to this challenge. So while the odds on the ground are decreasing of a full-out invasion, Putin sees his window of opportunity to establish himself as Putin, the redeemer of these lost Russian lands, as closing. 18 months, perhaps less. And no one fully comprehends what's going on and how Putin is making those calculations. One thing we do know is Putin understands and respects raw power.
I think a lot of people respect raw power, so I'm going to exercise some right now. Thank you. I can't do more now. Look at all these cards. I only have room for one more question. In fact, it's 4:30 now, so I'm cheating. I'm going to hold you a minute longer. And I'm going to combine two questions because one of them says, your two arguments are mutually exclusive. That is for Mr. Robinson and Mr. Wrzesnewskyj. Your two arguments are mutually exclusive. Will each of you try to identify an area where you can agree on the facts? And this underlined the facts. All right, here's one fact that maybe I'd like to know whether you can agree on. This question says, what about the attack on the airliner flying over Ukraine? Who is responsible for that? If you can even agree on that little bit of a fact, I think we will have had a triumph for the day. You too. Fred, you're out of it for this one.
Well, I repeat my last comment, but full-out Russian invasion is less likely now than a year ago. I think that's true. And my view on the airliner is I think the rebels probably did it. The reason, my logic for that is that A, they were the people shooting planes down in that area at that time. B, at the end of June, we got reports that the rebels had overrun a air defense base. And very soon afterwards, we started getting pictures of what's called a... Do we have any chalk? That might help.
I don't know.
Okay, well, you have something called a teller. If I get all technical military, you have the teller, with the transporter, erector, launcher, and radar. Okay?
Yeah.
And that's the thing which has the tracks, and it has some missiles on it and a little radar thing at the front. Okay? And we started seeing pictures of some of these things floating around almost immediately after they said they'd overrun the base. Okay? What you didn't have, though, to make this work properly, it needs to have a much bigger radar system and a command and control system. We never saw any of that. So my own instinct is that they did actually get their hands on one of these things. Okay, but you can't really use these properly if you don't have the rest, and especially if you don't have any training. So all you can really do is see something in the sky and press the shoot button and hope that this tiny little radar here does the rest of the job automatically, right? So I think that the Ukrainians deny that they captured one of these, but the Ukrainian authorities regularly say things which are not true. And the rebels deny. This is one thing the rebels and the Ukrainian army actually agree on, is that the rebels never got hold of one of these things. The fact that they both agree on it means they probably did. I think they got hold of one of these things from the Ukrainian army, saw a plane flying in the sky, said, oh, it must be Ukrainian, and fired it off. I have no proof of that. And I think you must have a proper investigation which investigates all possibilities. The Ukrainian army did shoot down an airliner in 1991. No, was it 2001? I think it was. October 2001. So, you know, they're proven they can do it by mistake. So, we need to investigate all possibilities, but I think the rebels probably did it.
There are people in the audience who want to add things, and our rule is nobody can add anything without being up here. What you can do is write to this blog. It's not a blog, but it's a website. Post anything you want, sir, but I'm not taking questions or comments from the audience. Do you want to add something quickly?
It's actually, our agreement is much narrower than the assumption of the questioner. I think we can agree that it was shot down from territory controlled by Russia's proxies. However, the actual shooters and where this equipment came from, there's an interesting internet investigative group, Bellingcat, I believe that's the correct name, Bellingcat, that seem to quite irrefutably show that this particular, with markings on it, this particular Buk system came in from Russia. They've managed through photographs, and this is the wonderful thing about the internet and everyone having a cell phone that can take pictures and videos, shows it coming from Russia, arriving in the territory controlled by the Donetsk People's Republic, and then leaving back for Russia. So it appears that this equipment came in from Russia. It requires the local fighters do not have or did not have the technological know-how how to properly use it. So the odds are that this was actually a Russian military unit that brought this equipment in. I believe Bellingcat also has located where the radar installation that you're talking about that would direct came from. There are also some conversations that were intercepted that talked about an airliner and the necessity of shooting it down, and a decision was made at some point, but it did come in from Russia. That seems to be irrefutable. And I think the odds are it was a Russian army unit that shot this down.
Okay, I could just respond. I'd say Bellingcat is notoriously biased. It's also run by a guy. It's run by some guy It's run by some guy who has no military training out of his basement. Having said that, they've done some quite good work, so I'm not all bad. But I read the Bellingcat report. There were a few problems with it. One, this Buk missile Telar was seen driving around on a white flatbed truck, which had been taken from some truck company in Lugansk. That seems pretty clear. But why on earth would the Russian army, if it was the Russian army's Buk Telar, drive it around on a white flatbed truck from a truck company in Lugansk? I mean, this is a little odd. And there's no. Why would they take it in there without the associated equipment, which they need to use it properly? And then also these intercepted conversations. Well, a lot of them, there were these intercepted conversations we got from the SBU in Ukraine, in which Cossacks say, "Hey, we've shot something down." Right? So actually, not Ukraine, not Russian army guys, but a bunch of Cossacks who were saying, "Hey, we just shot something down." Right? So actually, it was militia guys who were saying they shot something down, not
those
Russian
aren't
army.
the ones I was referencing.
So yeah, but worry about it. It's there's nothing is settled on this.
How quickly?
All we can do is speculate. Okay.
How quickly
Okay,
does
I'm
a
going
Buk
to
system
put a
Can
stop
I
to this
own
because I can
power?
see this
Slowly,
is
but you do the Russian, you do the
going to
Russian
go.
part.
I can see there are people in the audience who have thoughts on this. Please write them your comments on this webpage. No, we do not accept. We do not. I'm sorry. Either be quiet. I'm sorry. I'm chairing this meeting, and you be quiet. Hush.
Please, we'll have to.
Out or be quiet. We're not having that kind of activity in this room. That's the end of it. No more of that from anybody. Now that's an order. All right. One last question, and this is for Fred Weir. A little lighter tone. Not by much, but what is your opinion on the state of journalism in Ukraine today? Specifically, their persistent fakes produced by Censor.net and TSN, and their treatment of displaced journalist Anatoly Sharis. Charisse, all right? Sherry? I don't know any of this, but this is the last question, and it's Fred's, and only Fred's.
Good. Okay, first, could I just interject something about the airliner? Because I was also, I have the...
I have to be nice
job.
to Fred, but okay.
It's part of my job to watch the Twitter feed and Facebook pages of rebel leaders in Donetsk. And I know that late June, they were posting pictures of a book system that they had captured in an air base near Donetsk. They later deleted all that.
Who's they? Sorry?
The rebels. The rebels. They did have one. And this was reported. I can provide you, if you're skeptical, I can provide you with links because it was reported in the Russian media as well. Pictures of the thing. Also, I personally think it's just a little bit crazy to imagine that anybody shot it down deliberately, because this is the assumption that seems to be out there, that a Russian army unit, well trained, came in and shot down this airliner. I really don't think that was in anybody's interest, and whatever conversations there were between rebel leaders showed that they were mightily embarrassed once they realized that it was an airliner that was shot down, and they deleted everything in their Twitter feed. I know this. You have to go to, there's a website where they resurrect things from the grave in the internet, and you can still find those things there. But it was clearly a massive screw up on their part, and it was probably incompetent people with maybe half a system, as Professor Robinson said, but a terrible, terrible tragedy anyway. So as for the state of journalism in Ukraine, I think one thing we do forget is that it is pretty much the same political culture in a lot of ways as you find in Russia. And under the conflict situation, there has been quite a lot of, pressures. I mean, Ukraine is basically still a democratic country with a more or less active civil society, but yet you do see people being accused of treason. That a Ukrainian journalist named Roman Kotsuba has been arrested for posting a YouTube video saying that he wasn't going to accept his draft notice and didn't advise anyone else to do so. He's charged with treason, apparently. Ukraine just barred 100 Russian journalists from being accredited to cover Ukraine. There are certain things like that happening that are worrisome. I personally find the moves to ban the Communist Party also really worrisome, in the sense that you are gradually removing there in Kiev, using legal mechanisms, removing organizations that have clout and traction in the East from participation in the political process, whether you like the Communist Party or not. This is a really bad thing. In fairness, a lot of my colleagues are beginning also to cover these developments in Ukraine. I haven't seen it much in the Canadian or U.S. media, but I know the Guardian has written about both the draft evasion movement in Ukraine, which is growing, and the repression of journalists. By the way, that Ukrainian journalist, Roman Kotsuba, has been declared a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International. So these things are happening in Ukraine, and I find it heartening that in the West, even though we have these split narratives and everybody's quite passionate, like I think we've seen that here, and I haven't had the pleasure of attending the whole conference, but I suppose you've had a good deal of that. Completely opposite narratives at this conference, and I experience it every day. But I do think that a lot of my colleagues are doing pretty good work on this and calling the Ukrainian authorities to account on some of these things, and I hope that those tendencies to use the war situation to crack down on dissent in Ukraine won't go much further.
Thank you so much, Fred. And thank the other panelists as well. Thank you all very, very much.